Welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Expert. I am thrilled to be joined here by Dr. Erica Lacher. And we are also joined by Ari, who is Erica's cat, and he's sitting on her lap. So if you guys see a little orange, if you're on the video and you see a little orange head pop up, that's who that is. But Erica, thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're here tonight and that we're gonna jump into this topic of myth busting.
Oh, it's one of my favorite topics. And if my head suddenly gets yanked, that's because Ari grabbed the microphone cord, or the headphone cord. So sorry, everybody. What would
Honestly,
life
it
be
keeps it
without cats?
interesting. Yeah. People, yeah.
Exactly.
Horse people understand that if it's not cats, it's dogs or both or anything. Anything with four
Exactly.
legs.
Yeah. And they're all going to
um,
bring you problems in one way or another. So we can talk about all of the myths about how they bring us those problems.
exactly. And I was telling Dr. Lasher before we went live here, I was like, I wasn't sure how many myths we would have to cover here. And then I was sitting in front of me is like a list of like 50 of them. So I feel like we have plenty here to keep us busy and maybe even for a part two, depending on how many we get through. Um, Before we kind of jump into me just going down this laundry list, I would love to hear from you if there are any common horse myths that you've encountered kind of in your day-to-day veterinary practice. I know that's a kind of a general question, but I want to know if there's any that are like very top of mind for you.
There's three biggies. So we're going to walk a colic. I hear that one on a regular basis. Please don't do it. I got that one this morning. Uh, Power tools for dentistry are really, really bad, and old horses don't need vaccines. So those are the three that I experience on a regular basis. And the colic one, I get it. We all want to have something to do while we're waiting for a veterinarian to get there to help us. But walking doesn't really help anything. It just leaves you and your horse tired because you've walked around and around. I don't mind it for a few minutes at a time. If your horse is feeling particularly agitated, something like that, I'll take them out for maybe 2 to 4 minutes of wandering around, not, walking, but wandering around, seeing if changing sites changes things. But walking them doesn't help. And, I think that myth comes from, oh, if they lay down and roll, they're going to twist their gut. And what we now know is that they actually twist their gut and then they lay down and roll because it's painful. It's not the other way around. So that's a biggie for me. Power tools and dentistry. How many of you are out there hand sawing every plank of wood that you put onto a fence that your horse has taken out? I bet it's not many because we find that hand sawing just sucks and nobody wants to do it. So it's the same concept. Yes, you can cut your finger off with a power saw, but being safe and being educated on how to use tools allows us to do a better, faster, more thorough job on a dental float for any horse that we see. And it allows me to do it for longer because I'm not compromising my rotator cuffs on a regular basis. So that's that one. And then vaccines for older horses. There's sort of this myth that if we vaccinate them enough, the immune system will be like, all right, I finally got it. You've shown me this vaccine a million times and I get it. If anything with our older horses, it goes the other way. Their immune system gets a little dementia and it forgets what it's supposed to look at. And so we need to make sure that we are keeping them very regular on vaccines, especially, I'm here in Florida, Florida where we have encephalitis 365 days a year. So, keeping those horses up to date on even the basic core vaccines is super, super important for their longevity.
That one is really interesting because yeah, I'm curious. I'm just wondering how that ever came about. People were thinking that way because yeah, just you would think that you would need more as you get older, just as your body deteriorates.
And the same thing
Um,
happens with parasites. Like we have to be really aware that some of our older horses, while they may have managed parasites really well for their whole life, as they get older, their immune system is probably not going to do as well managing those either. And so doing those fecal egg counts once a year at least to see where you are is a very good idea.
Super helpful. And we're gonna get into colic. I've got a bunch of related to that. You kind of covered some of them, but I'm gonna make sure we cover all of them. Before we do the dental topic, the power tools one was one of the ones I had, so that's great. Um, young horses don't need dental care.
So, young horses, if anything, need more frequent dental care. Now, we may not be doing as much, but we need to touch them up on a more regular basis. And by young, I mean horses in the year to 5 year age range. So, under a year, most of them don't. I usually recommend that as they're getting their baby vaccines, so they're 5, 6 months old, they're getting their first vaccines, we're going to evaluate their teeth and make sure we don't see something where we're like, whoa, we have a problem we need to address. But if we don't see that, then we may allow them to just go on until they're in their year to 2 year old stage. At that point, we may look at wolf teeth and discuss with you whether they need to be removed or not. To be honest, for most horses, they do not need to have their wolf teeth extracted. You can, but it's not 100% necessary. So that's a discussion to have with your veterinarian for sure. We're also going to look again to see that they are having those teeth come in appropriately. If you're starting to do any groundwork, lunging, some of that kind of stuff, especially some of the stock horse breeds, they tend to do younger work, work on those horses as they're younger. We want to make sure they don't have points for that halter, even a halter, to push on against the side of the mouth. And young horses have very soft teeth. So they develop very sharp points very quickly. So I may do a super quick float, but I'm going to need to do it more often to make sure they don't have those sharp points.
Awesome. And I should have mentioned prior to just jumping right in, if you are listening live and you have any myths that I'm not throwing at Dr. Lacher here, definitely drop those in the chat and I will relay those to you. And also if I say something and it's not a myth, we can start with, is it a myth or is it not? And then why it is, if it is, kind of thing. Which I'm sure that goes without explaining, but strong start with the young horses don't need dental care. What about old horses don't need dental care?
So old horses definitely need dental care from a different standpoint. And again, in that 12 to 18, 20-year-old period, most horses, and here comes the cat. Yep, sorry about that. There we go. There's a tail for you guys. Um, Most horses, again, they're at a relatively stable period in their dental life. So we recommend if they're working for a living, then we go and we look at them for sure once a year. Some of our, brood mares who are doing less performing, some of those will get on to like an 18-month, 2 year schedule where we just make sure nothing's going off the rails. Now, when they get over that 18 to 20 year period, we're starting to have them wear out their teeth. So they don't grow tooth throughout their life. They erupt the tooth they have from the time that they're around 4 years old. So we want to make sure that that process happens correctly. And it very often, I mean, they're horses. Of course, it's not going to happen correctly. So we want to follow that process and make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do, or we're removing teeth as they need to be removed before they're creating giant problems.
Got it. And then related to dental, this one is sedation is optional.
Sedation is non optional. And, we can talk about power tools, but the most important thing I do when I look at a horse from a dental standpoint is I sedate them. I open their mouth with a full mouth speculum and I shine a very bright light in there. Most important thing I do, I cannot do those things without sedation, which means I can't get a good exam. I mean, if you think about what happens when you go to the dentist, if you were a horse without sedation, would you let them put their fingers in their mouth the way they do for you? No. So, that's where sedation becomes super important for these guys is to allow us to do that quality exam and make sure we aren't missing anything.
That makes perfect sense. Wonderful explanation. Okay. Are there any other dental myths we should cover before jumping over to the next topic?
I think that's the biggest one. I will just throw out there really, really quick. If your horse has a one-sided nasal discharge and it stinks, it's a tooth until proven otherwise. So there you go. My 2 cents for the day.
Super helpful. Okay. Colic. This one is it true that feeding horses immediately before or after exercise can cause colic or digestive issues?
I'm going to put this one in the maybe category. Many of our modern concentrates are very different than, I'm going to age myself, but what I grew up as feeding horses. So we feed just very different commodities that are designed for the equine GI tract. And in general, we feed less. So if we're looking at a horse who's eating, somewhere in the less than 3 to 4 pounds of a concentrate, you are absolutely fine to feed that right before you ride for sure. If they're overly hot, I tend to not do it right after you ride. But, if it's a cool day, I don't know what that is currently in Florida because we haven't had any. But, if it's relatively cool, you didn't do a whole lot of work, I'm okay with them eating after. Again, the big thing for me is how hot are they from the exercise. But again, those concentrates we feed today are designed to really work with the GI tract as opposed to, when I was a kid, we fed whole oats and corn and things like those, and they would definitely create a lot of gas in the system, and that's not great before or after. I will take most of my ulcer horses or ulcer prone horses and feed them right before exercise, but I'm feeding them hay because I want to put that bulk in there to help prevent the acid from sloshing around. So this one I'll put in the it depends category.
Okay. And if they're hot after, you're just waiting until they cool down before feeding them?
Yep. Yeah, I and that, for horses, honestly, if they're really hot, that can take 30 to 45 minutes, just because of the nature of how excellent a heat sink horses are. They really hold on to heat well.
Okay. Um, Colic is from a twisted gut.
Very rarely. I have 2 colics standing in my clinic right now. Neither of them is a twisted gut. We've had the one for about 6 hours today, the other we've had for 3 days, and they are due to impactions. Now, on both of these horses, I cannot tell you why they have impactions. They are fed incredibly well. They're fed high quality hay. Their life is perfect. Unfortunately, the equine GI tract is very poorly designed. Any plumber would look at it and be like, "Oh my lord, were you asking for clogs?" And the answer is yes, we were asking for clogs. So, from that standpoint, I don't have an answer on these horses, but most of the colics we see are due to, in this area, coastal hay, and not drinking enough water in some way. That's the favorite MO of horses, is to get some sort of impaction due to not drinking enough water.
Okay. And you had mentioned the laying down and rolling doesn't cause it, but is it still this next one is don't let a colicky horse lay down. Is that still true?
Nope, I let mine lay down. What I generally tell my owners is, if you wouldn't use the word flail or violent, they can do whatever they want to do. So a lot of those guys will lay down, they'll lay on their side, they'll sit up, they'll lay on the side, they'll sit up. And I'm like, think about how you feel when you have a bellyache. You're laying on your side and you're sitting up, you're doing the exact same thing. So I let them do that. We also know that all of that rolling doesn't cause the gut to twist. It twists because of the way it's hooked in, which is again just a stupid design. And then the gut tries to peristalse or move the food along. It can't, and that causes the twist. For some of these horses, especially the gas colics, I'll send them out to roll around, and that does a lot once I add some drugs and some hydration on board. So, I will get them up and try and keep them from rolling if they are in a situation where I can't keep them from hurting themselves. But the true, really twisted gut horses that are super painful are nearly impossible for most people to keep standing. So I try to put them in the safest place they can possibly be, and I'm going to drive to you as fast as I can.
That's really good to know, and it makes I mean, it makes so much sense, like, I totally yeah, when my stomach hurts, I'm, like, in the fetal position, it's like, you have to let them you've gotta let them, like, deal with it, I mean, they're in pain, that is hard.
Yep.
Okay, If you think your horse is colicky or colicking, you should try walking and giving Banamine before calling the vet.
I don't mind you giving Banamine. I just usually ask that you call me first. Because there's some colics I'm going to talk to you and say, like, hey, can we hold off on that? Most of them, I'm gonna say, "Nope, go ahead and give the Banamine." The other thing it lets me do, if you call me first and or, text me, whatever, just notify me that you're doing it. It allows me to sort of look at the rest of the day and say, "Okay, if this horse isn't getting better, what can I adjust? What can I move?" You guys wanna know why vets are always late? This is why. We're trying to play the schedule juggle on what we can do, but this lets us start to get ahead of that game. And again, just touch base with you and say like, maybe let's not give Banamine to that one. I'm going to head your way. And again, I don't walk them, so there's that.
Yeah. Okay. Change in weather increases the risk of colic.
So I want this one to be true so badly. Like I feel it in my heart that it's true. No study can verify that. And many, 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 many epidemiologic studies have looked at it and tried to prove that changes in weather increase the risk of colic. And we can't prove it other than in certain situations where the weather drops really, really cold and we have a profound change in either access to water because it freezes or we have difficulty getting water to the horses for some reason and so they don't drink enough water. But those are, when you guys have like the blizzards, that kind of thing up north, it's they've looked at Texas A&M has done a bunch of work trying to look at this, and certainly in Texas level weather, they have not seen an association.
It's wild. It's like these are yeah, these are things that are like just considered fact. It's like
I know, and I want the weather one to be true because I wanna believe it, but the more I look, like, we'll think about kinda what's going on in our practice, and we have been just hammered with colics the last 3 weeks. And the weather has not changed here in the last 5 or 6 weeks. Like, you could copy paste the weather report. I think the weather guy can just phone it in every day. It has been exactly the same for probably 6 weeks, and we are just hammered with them right now, and I don't know why. I don't have an answer.
oh man, those poor horses.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I have on colic. Do you have other colic myths you want to debunk before we move on?
Ooh, let me add just a really quick one. Mineral oil doesn't do a dang thing. Doesn't do anything. Now, we will sometimes use a bit of mineral oil to mark that things went from the front to the back, because if you've ever had a horse oiled, you will know that when it comes out the back end, because their tail is disgusting. So we do sometimes use it to mark that things went from the front to the back, but it doesn't actually help us manage the colic. Water and electrolytes helps us do that.
Awesome. Okay, well, if you're on the live and you have additional comments related to colic or dental, drop them in chat and I will ask. But we're gonna move on to some young horse myths. Um, Horses shouldn't be worked with until they are done growing. Um, this has a note to talk about the growth plate discussion.
Yeah, so we had a discussion. We have a blog on our website at Springhill Equine. It is now called Winnie's Wisdoms. This one is under the Tuesdays with Tony category, but you can find any of them by just hitting the search bar. Our office cat Tony wrote the blog until he passed away from very old age. He had a wonderful, wonderful cat life, that's for sure. But again, this is one of those things that we all want to sorry, my cat is playing with the desk here. Uh, we all want this to be true, right? Like we want it to be that, oh, we need to get these horses to a certain age. And it makes sense when we think about, oh, their bones are softer. Like we can sort of justify it, right? But the truth is that horses are teenagers when we think of them in that 1 to 3 year old period. So that's their teenage years. And we don't ask teenage humans to sit on the sidelines. Now we need to do appropriate work for them, but now is the time when you can set those bones and tendons and ligaments and muscles to what their workload is going to be in the future. So you're not going to take that horse that you want to be a 5-star eventer and do 5-star eventer work, but you're going to say to the bones and the tendons and the ligaments and the muscles and the heart and the lungs, you're going to need to be an athlete in the future, and I need you to be ready to jump, and I need you to be ready to, carry yourself in dressage, and I need you to be able to lengthen that stride on cross country. So we need to set them up for what that is when they're young horses. It's when we have the absolute most influence over the long-term structure of bones, tendons, and ligaments. And so there's really good work from Michigan State looking at bones in particular on young thoroughbreds. And what they have found is that the problem with baby thoroughbreds isn't that we're breaking them too early, and that's why they're experiencing fractures. It's that those baby thoroughbreds are going from being in fields turned out to being in stalls for 22 hours a day. Yes, they're exercising, but they're no longer out in fields. And when that happens, they get a profound loss of bone strength because they're standing around for 22 hours a day. So I'm not saying go out and work the snot out of your 2-year-olds, but it's a great time to set the foundation for what you want that body to do when it's a grown up body.
The next one is related. All horses' brains are ready to work when they turn 3.
I think anyone with horses knows that one's not true. And this goes back to, the working young horses, right? Like it's doing what the horse's brain can handle, and asking them to do a little bit so that we can condition it. I think certainly we've all been around the warm blood that isn't functional until they're 7. I have a 13-year-old in the barn. I'm not sure she's functional yet. So I think this is one of those where if I'm having training difficulties, I will seek out someone and say, like, hey, am I asking too much? Am I asking it the wrong way? Do you think this horse just isn't ready for this? It's one of those things where, especially when you've ridden babies, you feel like you have to treat them for like a baby for a certain amount of time. And then there's that moment where, okay, we've got to treat you like an adult. And I find as the person doing the riding, that's a hard moment for me to find without an outside source being like, time to be a grown up. But yeah, I think there's definitely young horses that can't handle the pressure, but we should figure out what they can do for something to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always like getting a second opinion or asking someone else for help is I think it's like always a good idea. Um, okay, you kind of mentioned this one related to the thoroughbreds going from being in fields to being in stalls all day. But this next one, I don't know if you have anything to add to this next one, which is racehorses fall apart because they are started too early.
And like I said earlier, that's not the primary reason. It's actually more the time they spend in the stall. But it's also that on those young horses, we need to have enough strength for them to support what they're doing. You guys have had a number of biomechanics people and physiotherapists on here, and I that is so important that one of the big things that happens with race horses is that we push the limb beyond what it can support, and we get breaks as a result of that. We get breaks in the bones, we get breaks in the tendons and ligaments. And so it's giving those young horses the time to build that muscle strength they need to support what we're asking them to do. And I would tell you that's the bigger thing we see in racehorses is that we have this timeline on them where they need to go to a race by such and such a time to pay for themselves basically. And if we're doing that too quickly and we don't have the muscle base, then the limb can't handle it. So it's not necessarily too early, it's not quite right.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always blown away by the fact that like the thoroughbreds are so young and they're doing so much. And it's like, I mean, yeah, seems like a tough recipe. And a lot of horses are totally fine with it, which is a miracle.
Yeah, lots of them
um,
are, and a lot of them, especially when you get them off the track and you're restarting them for a lot of the things that, those of us who are ride IQers do with them, we need to take that moment and say, "Okay, I need to go backwards and put the muscle strength on you to do what I'm asking you to do."
Absolutely. So that's all the myths that I have related to young horses. Is there anything you wanted to add to that topic?
No, I think, like I said, the biggest thing is find something to do with them. That's good for them.
Give them a job. It's everyone's always telling me that about my dog. Give him a job. It's like, okay.
I have a dog trainer client that tells me that on a regular basis, and she can get a dog to do anything. She's like, "Yeah, they just need a job." I'm like, "Oh, oh."
Yeah, I'm like, okay, what can I teach him what to do today? I will say it actually is effective. He does love it. Um, okay, scheduled care. Joint injections should be done on a regular schedule.
No. Nope. It's not like the oil change in your car, and this is where for some of these horses, having a great relationship with your veterinarian is super important. We harp on that on our podcast all the time. And it's that, I totally understand that we have competition goals. So let's say that your goal is to get to the AECs that are Labor Day weekend, right? So they're usually the end of summer. If we have a horse that we know that we're watching and we're saying, okay, they maybe their stifles, for instance, are their weak point. You're doing the work to make sure those stifles are happy and you're doing the strength training and all of those things. That's a horse I may look at in the beginning of summer and say, okay, how are we doing? And if that horse is showing me something, I might say, you know what? I understand that the goal is AECs. We may look at saying we aren't 100% there on joint injections, but we're going to do them before because I want to make sure you can get there. But in general, I try to have the horses tell me that they need that joint injection now. And if I'm doing the work to do the muscle building, I'm doing the PT that I like to add to every one of these horses. I don't ever inject a joint and not send you home with something to do to try to never see me again for an injection in that joint. If those things are working, then we are going to wait for that horse to tell us we're having an issue with that joint before we go back in it. Because yes, they may have a chronic issue, and this is true much more for the older horses, but for the younger horse, just because I go in their left stifle doesn't mean that I may ever need to go in it again. And if I set it up on a schedule, I might be missing something that's going on elsewhere on that horse. So I want to go over them and make sure that what I'm looking at is the source of the problem.
I love that. This next one is dewormers should be administered on a regular schedule.
So 1980s, probably 1990s, but anyway, no, to some extent. Every horse should get dewormed at least once a year. That is dependent on where you live as to when it happens. So in Florida, for us, I like to say that we do it when the weather gets cool. I don't think that's ever going to happen this year. So I say if we haven't had any cold weather by December 31st, you can go ahead and deworm your horse. We recommend that that happens again. We're going to do it typically in North America. We're going to do it in the fall sometime when the weather cools off. And that's going to be with a product that is either ivermectin or moxidectin and also contains praziquantel. Those are going to hit all of the major classes of parasites, but that's the only time we are going to hit them without having a fecal egg count first. For the rest of North America in particular, we're going to recommend a fecal egg count sometime in the spring. When you start to see the grass come up and turn green again, time to do a fecal egg count. So whatever that means for where you live, you're going to grab that piece of poop, bring it on down to your veterinarian. We love poop. It's what we do. And we're going to check it to see if there's parasites in it. And if there aren't, we're not going to deworm.
Wow. Um, so when you're checking that, if there aren't, and you're not going to deworm, when do you check in again? The following year?
Yep, we've gone to about once a year. For some of our horses, if we have a question, we're gonna grab another one and see like has something changed. And our ones that change are for the most part are old horses. The very young horses will also change somewhere around a year to 2 years of age. The type of parasites they get will change, and so that will change what we do for deworming on them. So we are checking fecal egg counts on them. So we usually start at about 12 to 15 months, see what we have. If we still have ascarids present, we're going to do another fecal egg count on them in probably another 4 or 5 months and see if they've learned how to manage ascarids on their own. So, like there, we're just looking for that transition moment from when they go to baby deworming to grown up deworming.
Okay. That is what I have on scheduled care, and some of this next category might fall into this category, but the next category is miscellaneous, so
It's a lot of miscellaneous.
yeah, exactly. I didn't have a fancy title for these ones. Did you have anything else related to scheduled care before we jump over?
Vaccines are scheduled care. I don't know that
Okay.
that's a myth, but I living in Florida, I will tell you that vaccines are twice a year. It's non-negotiable. And the big reason is the encephalitis here can affect a horse and they don't respond particularly well to that vaccine. So doing it on a regular basis keeps them safe. And this is a bit gory, but it is the worst death you've ever seen a horse have to go through. And I would rather vaccinate them twice a year than do that any day of the week.
Yeesh. Yeah, that's a good PSA for people. Okay. Don't let a hot horse drink cold water.
Very, very, very much been busted. Very much. And it's they tend to not want as much of that cold water when they're hot, but horses who are hot can drink all the water they want and do just fine.
Why did people think that that was not okay?
Um, I don't have good answers for some of these. I can tell you, for example, in Russia, they think that if you sit on cold concrete, you're going to be infertile. So,
Oh.
there's random myths that we come up with for cold all the time. I do think that if you look at the way we historically fed horses, so for example, whole grains, post exercise, they were much more prone to gas colics from those whole grains, and it just has to do with the way digestion occurs in the horse. They're hindgut fermenters, so you heat them up, and fermentation happens faster when you're hot, which means more gas. So, older types of feeds were more prone to causing gas colics, get them hotter after work. So I can see that there was just this association with horses drinking water and gas colicking, but it wasn't the water, it was the grain. That's my best guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, okay, maybe you don't know, but I've also heard, like, don't feed a dog cold water when they're hot. Is the same is that do we happen to know if that's a myth as well?
I'm a really bad dog vet, but I would say that's a myth as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Only older horses get PPID or Cushing's.
So in general, we start looking for it with most horses over the age of 15. So when I started, I would say that was an older horse. I gotta say now, I'm gonna say that 20 is an older horse. I have lots of horses over 15 doing a whole lot of work, but we do see it in horses as young as 9 to 10 years old with certain caveats. So those horses usually have spent a good portion of their life very overweight. There's a strong association between being overweight and developing early PPID or Cushing's. They're horses who have probably had high insulin levels for most of that time in their life or had what we call metabolic syndrome. Again, those are very strongly associated with that and certain breeds. So, like, I think Arabians, Morgans, any of your fat pony breeds, which is all of them, right? So, any of those, if I'm suspicious and I'm looking at a horse who's, in the 9ish, 10ish to 15-year range, and I'm having trouble getting things to do what I want them to do, then those are horses that I'm probably going to go ahead and pull an ACTH, which is the test we use for PPID, but I'm also going to pull an insulin, which is the test we use for metabolic syndrome.
Man, your brain has you're just like an encyclopedia of knowledge. It's insane. Like I'm just listening to you and I'm like, how do you have all this just like completely in there? It's very impressive.
I ride
Um
horses and I study stuff. That's it. That's my life.
whatever you're doing, it's working. So it's great. Alfalfa will make my horse spicy.
This one is a little bit of it depends. There are rare horses out there that are truly allergic to alfalfa. And I do find that that allergy manifests as diarrhea for sure. And just general, I don't know that they're spicy in the way that we think as much as they're just like, maybe their skin itches or, they're just not happy in their environment and we get them off of it and off they go. But that is relatively rare. Alfalfa is actually more akin to eating steak than it is to eating ice cream. And, your ice cream is what sends your kid through the roof, not when you feed them steak. Alfalfa is very high in protein and it's very low in sugar. So it is nearly the perfect food for horses. They need a tiny bit of addition of some vitamins and minerals to make it the perfect food for them, but not much. So alfalfa is my go-to as the cheapest, best way to feed horses because it has everything they need 95% of the way.
Wow. Okay. I don't need a purchase exam on an unbroke horse.
You need a more in-depth pre-purchase exam on an unbroke horse. This is always this is hard. Pre-purchase exams for veterinarians are they're a rock and a hard place for us, right? Like I promise you, we want to do the very best job we can to look at this horse and decide if it's going to do what you want it to do. The truth of the matter is the very best indicator of future performance is past performance. So when you're looking at a horse who is out there running 2-star cross country and you want to do training level, the chances are pretty good you're going to be all right. That horse is going to do that. When I'm looking at a yearling that has had absolutely nothing done with them, I got nothing to go on. I also may have a horse that I can't do as much manipulation with. They may not be as good on the lunge line. I certainly can't see them under saddle if they're the young horses that aren't broke. And so as a result, I have to get more information to try to decide where is this horse, on the spectrum of what am I going to be when I grow up. We're also on young horses who aren't broke. We're on a little bit of an OCD hunt. And OCD stands for osteochondrosis dissecans, which is just a malformation in how the cartilage forms in a joint. It can be no big deal. It can be a really big deal. So it just depends on where that is. So we're often radiographing these horses pretty extensively going on a hunt. Now, can I go off on a slight PPE tangent, especially on an unbroke horse?
Please do.
Back x-rays mean absolutely nothing on a pre-purchase exam. Neck x-rays are pretty close to meaning absolutely nothing on a pre-purchase exam. And we, as veterinarians, feel very backed into a corner to take these x-rays. And I get it. I don't know the right answer, right? But if there is the absolute even hint of two spinous processes considering a tiny cheek peck, no one is going to look at them because they're going to be sure they have kissing spine. You can walk into the highest levels of sport, no matter what that sport is, take back x rays and find kissing spines. Just because we see it on radiographs, it has to correlate with clinical signs on an exam for it to mean anything for us. Also, just because I don't see it in a 2-year-old doesn't mean that horse won't have them later. It doesn't mean that when they get them later, they'll even be clinical. So, kissing spines for me are a tough, tough, tough radiographic ask.
Yeah, and the thought or the statement that you need to get a pre-purchase exam on an unbroke horse actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, you just explained it, but it makes a lot of sense because this horse has not had the pressures like you haven't pressure tested their body yet. So you don't actually have indicators of like this is where it's going to break down. So you have to go and look and see like here is where it's going to break down to find it because like I mean otherwise if you're buying the 2-star horse, like, yeah, that body has done it and it's proven that it's capable of doing it. So that one makes a lot of sense, even though I can see people making the argument of like, well, I'm buying this unbroke horse for very little money. Why would I spend the same amount of money getting a PPE? But I mean, in the long run, it makes sense.
Yeah, and it's not and I totally understand it. I get it. Maybe you find a good deal on something and it hasn't done much or it looks like it's fine, it's just coming out of a pasture, but I'm like those are the ones where it's even more important you spend the money.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you're gonna maybe resell it later on. Um, okay, this next one is I think my horse is faking a lameness to get out of work.
I've never, ever, ever found a horse that fakes a lameness. And when you talk to behaviorists, like Sue McDonald is a really good one. She's at the University of Pennsylvania, and they have very keen understandings of how the equine brain works. And it's just not like, I love my horse and I think she's the smartest thing on the planet, but that is not the way their brain works. That's just not someplace that they can go. Now, we can create conditions that appear that way, right? So, one of my least favorite things to work through is what we call a rein lame horse, where it is actually you putting pressure on the bit as you're posting, or, some movement you're doing is putting pressure on the bit and it's making your horse bob their head. They learn that behavior. They're amazing at learning what we teach them to do. Some days it may not feel that way, but they really are. And so we have taught them to do that, right? So now I have to unteach that behavior. And as a veterinarian, I have to try and figure out, like, is this a lameness or is this what we call a rein lameness where it's, not quite real? So, but I will say that there is something creating a situation where that horse is showing us either a symptom of pain or we've taught it to be lame. So I will always go back and look at those. My favorite way to manage these horses is I ride them bareback and see, does the same thing happen? I put a different rider on them. Does the same thing happen? And I do what I call a butte trial, which is where we typically do around 2 grams of butte for the average size horse for 3 days, and we see what happens. And all that tells us is, okay, if things improve after day 3, we have pain somewhere. Now we have to figure out where it is.
Yeah, okay, that makes and if they're still bobbing their head after day 3, it's clearly you've got yourself a rider issue.
Yeah. I, I like to say it's usually the rider when I'm involved, but
Honestly, if I were to want one, I would say that's probably an easier one to manage than an actual lameness, so I'll take it.
For some of them, certainly.
Yeah. Uh, my horse seems uncomfortable. Should I worry about hindgut ulcers?
Ugh, the vague sense of unease. This is a real deal in horses. The vague sense of unease. Hindgut ulcers are definitely in the myth, legend, sketchy idea for me. There is one scientific paper, one, on hindgut ulcers in horses. It was done by someone who developed a supplement which supposedly cures hindgut ulcers. And it was done on horses pulled out of slaughterhouse situations. So I think we can agree that horses who are in slaughterhouse situations are not being taken care of the best. Certainly, there may be unbelievable amounts of stress in their life. There is a lot going on in those horses. So to look at those horses and say they have hindgut ulcers, real deal. For most of the horses that we see that are on good quality amounts of roughage, their hindguts are fine, and it is not a hindgut ulcer issue. But I never, never, never discount the vague sense of unease. It can just be difficult to determine why. And we just did a 4-part series on the podcast about the vague sense of unease and all the places that I see it come from. So we can talk for apparently 4 hours about that.
And that podcast that you're referring to is the Straight from the Horse Doctor's Mouth podcast, which correct? That's the one you're referring to?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
And everyone should go check it out for more wealth of knowledge from Dr. Lacher. Okay. My horse is making the gelding grunt. Is it because I need to clean his sheath?
I don't know why they make the gelding grunt. I have found a variety of reasons for it. Rarely has it been the sheath, but it's an easy one to rule out. So I think certainly it's worth it to see. While we're talking about that sheath, though, when we're talking about cleaning it, uh, when we clean them, I actually don't clean them. Like I clean a stall to spotless. I do not clean a sheath to spotless. I will generally use some type of lube, like think about like, KY lube, something along those lines. We use the lube we use for rectal palpation. And I get in there and sort of lube everything up remove the pieces that I can remove easily. But I very rarely come at them with anything that looks like a soap because we can destroy the normal flora that's in there. And most of us are women, I'm sure, since this is a horse event. You do not want to go buy that much monostat when you create that yeast infection.
That's a really good note because I could definitely imagine thinking that clean means clean.
Yeah, you can
Um,
over clean that puppy, that's for sure.
yeah, I believe that for sure. Okay. Some people believe that horses need salt licks year round. Are salt blocks actually necessary or can they be replaced with other supplements?
Salt blocks are hard because some horses don't like them. I do feel like they need access to salt, and nutritionists will tell you they need access to, at the very least, plain salt all year round. You can do the mineral salt as well, but it doesn't actually have minerals. It has some, but not enough to really count. But your horse having access to salt year round is important. You can watch your horse and see, are they one that licks a salt block? Some of them do, some of them don't. If they lick it, the chances are they're doing okay, but there's nothing in horses that makes them stop licking salt when they don't need any more. So, I don't know about you, but nothing in me tells me to stop eating Doritos when I've eaten the proper amount. And it's sort of the same with salt with horses. So if you have one that's obsessively going through a salt lick and you feel like they're exceeding what they should do, it's easy enough. They need about 2 tablespoons of salt a day. They get some of that in a commercial diet, but not much. They've actually designed them to be supplemented. So one place they've looked at to say, like, let's add some. So you can add just plain table salt. Most of the electrolyte supplements out there are also appropriate. You're going to look for things like sodium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium. You don't want to see a lot of long names that you don't know what they mean. Like, you should be able to kind of pick out what you're looking at. An electrolyte, they're a very, very simple supplement. The more stuff they have in them, the less likely they are to work and the more expensive they are for no good reason. There's a little bit of question always about sugar in electrolyte solutions, and a bit of sugar isn't a bad thing. The GI tract actually uses sugar to help pull sodium across it. So, to get that salt over, you need a bit of sugar. It's not a bad thing.
That's a really great I love that. And I feel like the knowing the ingredients of the electrolyte you're giving them is something that could be applied to like everything that you're consuming, that your horse is consuming, that we're all consuming. It's a good rule of thumb. Uh, is it true that blanketing a horse too early in the season can cause them to grow less coat?
So I cannot find this paper. I keep looking for it and I have not successfully found it yet. But there was a paper done in an animal science department in the Northeast where oh, there's the cat again. There we go. Um, where they looked at blanketing horses and they found that they do grow less hair, but it doesn't happen until like February or March. So not when you want it to happen. So, they found blanketing is important to keep them warm. Yes, it helps keep them warm. Doesn't do a dang thing for hair coat. Don't even use it for that. The other
Okay.
interesting thing from that, and like I said, I one of these days I saw it and then I cannot find it again. But they found that sheets, so turnout sheets with no insulation on horses with normal hair coats actually left them colder than something with at least some level of insulation. So it has changed a little bit the way I blanket my older guys. They don't wear blankets a lot here in Florida, but I was like, oh, you're furry. I'll just throw a sheet on you. So instead, I've switched to putting light blankets on them. They aren't sweating under them. They haven't told me yet that they don't like it. So here we are.
So are you saying that a sheet on normal hair length is colder than no sheet or just colder than a light blanket?
It is those horses were colder than no sheet. Like, it actually did impact the insulation quality of the hair. Now, they were not looking at horses who were body clipped. on
Hmm.
that. These were horses who had not been clipped. And there was a discussion about how clipping significantly changes the hair. We've all seen a clipped horse that the hair is just not the same for the rest of the season. So it doesn't if it applies very differently. But for the horse with a regular hair coat, a turnout sheet is probably less than useful.
Got it. Maybe a little counterproductive.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, huh.
What? Sorry, go ahead.
When I heard that, I was just like, huh. That made me go, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Okay. What's the real story behind the myth that a wet horse will catch a cold?
Oh boy, your wet horse is not going to catch a cold. And your wet horse is also not going to die of heat in the summer. It doesn't work that way. So I I don't know where these come from other than my best guess on the cold thing. You do not catch a cold from being cold, but if you stress your immune system from being cold and it gets suppressed and you're around other animals that have respiratory things, then you may get a cold. So, in particular, if your horse is at a horse show, they are exposed to other horses. And even if they're well vaccinated, they may catch a bit of a respiratory deal. So, that's the biggest thing I worry about. I think certainly for hosing horses off, they hold more heat than we do by far. So I am always trying to cool them off, even in situations where I might think that's not necessarily appropriate. Like I haven't, I'll be honest, I am a Florida child. I do not do cold weather. So I'm not much help for busting this up north, but I would tell you getting them wet is not the end of the world as long as you have a way to, throw wool coolers or something over them to help them dry appropriately.
Yeah. What's your take on the myth that mares are more difficult to manage and train than geldings? Is there any science to support this?
It's also in the potential category. So, one of the things that we do when we make geldings is that we take away the influence of hormones, and hormones are incredibly powerful. So, I I want this myth to not be true, but I think in some ways it is. I've heard good horsemen say that a gelding gives you 85% all of the time, every day. You can count on that. Stallions give you 100% some of the time, but you always got to fight for it. And a good mare will give you 110%. If she hates you, she's going to give you zero. So, I think there's definitely a hormone influence there. I do think that many of the behavior issues we have with mares I will get blamed on their ovaries, and I don't think that's necessarily true because the number of mares that I get asked to check for tumors on their ovaries is high, and the number of mares I see for tumors on their ovaries is very, very low.
Okay. Horses need shoes to be ridden.
Ooh, definitely busted. Mine does not have shoes, and she showed this past weekend. So there are, just like humans, there are horses with good feet and there are horses with bad feet. And if you have a really good farrier, they do not want to put a shoe on that foot until they have to. And the reasons they will have to is that the physics of the foot are bad. So, for example, one of mine that I just lost, it was a thoroughbred. So he had that long toe conformation. We had to put a shoe on him because Mother Nature gave him a foot that was not going to be long term functional. So we used a shoe to fix what Mother Nature put on incorrectly. So in that scenario, yes, he needs a shoe. But if we have a well conformed foot that has a solid, good quality wall, then many, many, many horses do not need a shoe. The other place we're going to need them. So if you look at the Olympic show jumpers that are out there that are jumping without shoes. One of the things that happens in show jumping is we are in incredibly consistent footing. Those horses without shoes still get shoes on when they're jumping on grass and in a limited way got shoes on. If you looked at the Olympics, for example, like King Edward got shoes on for one day, and it's to try to manage the soreness of jumping that big for that many days, right? So long term, they can certainly handle it. It's much harder when we look at what we're asking event horses to do because we need to be able to help them handle traction out on the course, and that doesn't apply to all of us for sure, But, once you get up the levels, you're probably going to need something in a stud. And the realistic way to do that is with shoes. So
Yeah.
it doesn't work for all of them in all disciplines, but for the most part, keep them barefoot as long as you can, as long as the foot says you can.
So do you see a lot of dressage horses without shoes? Just because, I mean, they're generally in the same footing.
I I think we could see more dressage horses without shoes, that's for sure. And I have quite a few that are doing not necessarily Grand Prix, but up the levels, fourth to starting FEI that don't have shoes on behind. One of the problems we get to when we're asking them to do all of that piaffe and passage and the pirouettes is that we are really asking them to sit on those hind feet, and we find they crush their heels if we don't give them a little extra support. And again, that's where Mother Nature wasn't necessarily designed to do what we're asking, and we need to help her out a little bit. So, but I think, until you're asking for all of that sit in that way, yeah, lots of these horses are on really good footing and could do great without shoes on.
Yeah. Um, well, this has been a power hour of myth busting. Are there myths that we didn't cover that you want us to
I
cover?
I think I'm out of myths.
There couldn't possibly be any more.
It's
uh,
horses. There's lots more.
I know there are more. I even have a couple more on my list, but I think we've covered the brunt of them. And I feel like this has been immensely productive, and I just I cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise with us. Before letting you go, I have one last question for you, which is what's one surprising thing that you've learned over your career that goes against traditional horse care wisdom?
Hmm. So, hmm, that's tricky. I guess I will say that 99% of the things that we think make horses colic do not make horses colic. Like I have in my head all of these things, like they overeat grain. Well, we get into the feed room and they're fine. Like the owner doesn't
Mhm.
notice it for 18 hours and they're fine. uh, we switch haze on them left, right, and center, and they're fine. And then, like, they just don't drink enough water for some reason, and they're colicky. So I think that's probably the biggest one. Is that I wish we have all of these ideas, and I think it's because we feel powerless as to like preventing this sometimes. But I will say, in general, good feed and a good hay program minimize how often you see me for colic, but certainly doesn't take it away 100%.
Yeah. I can see wanting to just have like a million things just not to do to try to avoid it because we all need to be a little bit more like less powerless in this fight against colic. Um, I wish or hope sending the two horses that you have at your clinic good vibes in their colic recovery. And Dr. Lacher, thank you so much for joining us again. I can't wait to have you on for another Ask an Expert. You are the ultimate expert. So thank you so much. And everybody who sent in myths and questions, we appreciate you. And have a wonderful evening, everyone. All done.
All right.
Thank you so much. That you are incredible.
Aw, thank you.
It is
How
like,
have you guys liked
wow.
Riverside? I have to ask real quick. Are you guys happy with Riverside?
Yeah, I switched over from StreamYard probably 3 months ago, and I do think the quality of the recordings is way higher, and the post-production, tool is really impressive.
All
Um,
right.
what do you guys use?
I'm the wrong person to ask that question.
Well, I do highly recommend Riverside. We have multiple personal accounts on Riverside because the business account starts at